My name is Tine McDonald from the Australian Association of Bush Regenerators, ARBA for short, and I'm your MC for this webinar. ARBA's hosting this webinar in partnership with Trust for Nature Victoria, and we have funding from the Foundation for National Parks and Wildlife. Now, ARBA is a national group representing bush regenerators, and we have a presence in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, and most other states. And Trust for Nature, there's a private land conservation trust doing marvellous conservation work in Victoria. And I'll now introduce Amelia Horton, Northeast Area Manager for Trust for Nature, who'll provide our acknowledgement of country. Thanks, and then Amelia.
Thanks, Tine. In the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I live on Tangarang country, and today I'm working on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung. As we're all tuning into this webinar from different locations, perhaps you would like to acknowledge the country you are joining us from today by typing into the chat box.
Great, I'm just typing mine in, so this will be interesting to have a look later to see from which countries everybody's tuning in. Now, there's a little bit of housekeeping. Now, all attendees are welcome to join in the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So instead of us having questions at the end of each speaker, we're going to concentrate those questions at the end in a 25-minute Q&A session. So if you have questions for the speakers, please type them ahead of time into the Q&A function. Now, this is not the chat box. The Q&A function can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So type your questions in there during the talks. But when you do that, as time goes on, please check the other questions as well. Because if someone's already typed in a question similar to yours, it's best that you don't repeat it. You just give it a thumbs up. So there's a function there to give it a thumbs up rather than asking it again. And this actually raises the priority for that question, and the people who are working out which are the priority questions to ask can find that very helpful. So by all means, if you want to talk to each other, comment or share links, use the chat box, but the Q&A will be taking its questions only from the Q&A box. So now we also have another little bit of housekeeping. And it's something we like to do with these webinars, and that's to see who's attending. So Suzanne's going to pop up on the screen a poll, who's in the room poll. And so if you can just click on the best answer for you, then we'll be able to do a very quick assessment and publish the results on the screen. Just got a minute for that. And Suzanne might publish those results on the screen when she's ready. Wow, nice. Thanks for that. Lots of agency staff, Covenantors, and other interested people. That's really nice to see. Now, in January 2020, ARBA mobilised to assist managers of fire-affected bushland, providing ecological first aid, we like to call it. Now, New South Wales members of ARBA were able to assist people in North and South Coast New South Wales whose sites were so severely affected. But even though sites in northern Victoria, northeast Victoria were also severely affected, Victoria members made efforts to do the same sort of work, but COVID lockdowns prevented this. So instead, Arbor's focused on preparing online resources and have reached out to our partner Trust for Nature Victoria to pull together this webinar to hear from those involved in the post-fire response in northeastern Victoria. So today, Arbor and Trust for Nature bring together 4 organisations as well as private landholders who are working in fire-affected Victorian areas. We've invited them to share their experiences 6 months on from the bushfires. Amelia Horton from Trust for Nature will now provide a perspective on the Trust for Nature and other agency programs in the NGO programs in the context of the Victorian areas affected. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tim. The Black Summer fires exposed over 1.8 million hectares across southeast Australia to high severity fires and caused dire consequence for people, communities and wildlife. While almost 18 months have passed, the feelings of anger and sadness over the devastation remain, and we will always remember the effect that the fires had on the environment. Trust for Nature is Victoria's dedicated private land conservation organisation. Since 1972, we've been working with private landholders to enhance and protect habitat forever. Over the fires, 46 landholders with conservation covenants were impacted, equating to 1,400 hectares across the Northeast and East Gippsland regions. Along with many others, we've been working to support landholders and habitat on private land to recover. Today's webinar aims to provide information on some of the efforts occurring across Eastern Victoria. The theme of the webinar is based around supporting recovery of fire-affected bushland, specifically the assisted regeneration actions taken by organisations and landholders to manage threats on public and private land.
Thanks very much. And we're almost ready for our first speaker, a little ahead of time. Our first speaker is Deirdre Griepsma from Parks Victoria. Deirdre's topic is working for the greater good, managing threats for biodiversity recovery after the 2020 fires. And Deirdre's the Regional Biodiversity Recovery Program Coordinator with Parks Victoria. So thanks very much, Deirdre.
Thanks, Tane. I can't share my screen while Suzanne is sharing hers.
Right, well, it looks like Suzanne's got the presentation up, but I think she might be shifting back to you now.
That's great, thank you. These technological challenges mean we're always learning, don't they? So, good morning, everybody. I'm hoping that you can see my presentation now. I'm getting a nod from team, so that's great. My name's Deirdre Griepsma. I'm the Bushfire Biodiversity Program Coordinator with Parks Victoria, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country we're on today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm on Bunurong country, which is South Gippsland. So I'd like to place this presentation in the context that successful delivery on biodiversity bushfire recovery programs has required and will continue to require a collaborative effort from all agencies and partners, whether that's public or private land, and requires solid relationships. The environment and the significant threat it faces due to the invasive species after the 1920s fires doesn't recognise boundaries. So this presentation I'm going to give you today provides a snapshot of the threat management works that Parks Victoria has delivered with a range of partners and stakeholders across the fire impacted landscape in Eastern Victoria. DELWP have undertaken many of the same activities on land under which they manage, with a focus on rainforest sites of significance. I don't speak on behalf of DELWP, but I can give you a bit of an insight of the biodiversity recovery work that they've been doing as well. So the work undertaken by Parks and DELWP after the 1920 fires have focused on threat management to protect high biodiversity and critical weight range mammals. This has been and continues to be within the 1920 fire footprint and associated refugia. A number of high value vegetation communities in East Gippsland and the northeast were impacted, including warm and cool temperate rainforest stands, also known as rainforest sites of significance, littoral rainforests and alpine bogs and fen vegetation communities. But to give you a little bit of a broader picture as well as to what Parks Victoria have faced, we've also had over $50 million worth of built assets impacted. Our major biodiversity and tourism sites have been impacted, and a number of the different lands that we have management across of national parks were burnt to different degrees. And just to give you an example, Burra Pine Mountain National Park was 100% burnt, so that was over 18,000 hectares. We had other parks such as Erranundra and East Gippsland that was 66% burnt. So there was a varying degree of impact that occurred in the national parks, which Parks Victoria manage. And that has also presented some issues with how do you go about helping these areas to recover, but also treating the associated refugia, which we know that is also critical for the survival of both flora and fauna. So biodiversity recovery, I'll give you a high-level snapshot of the bushfire biodiversity response and recovery work that's been done under Theme 4. There was a big plan that was developed with a number of stakeholders. DELWP took the lead in this space, and a number of the documents that you're seeing on the screen there have assisted us in understanding what pathway we should take, and also the funding that came through. So Theme 4 is intensified management of sustained threats, which has been over the last 12 months with the primary focus on protecting high biodiversity values, EVCs and critical weight range mammals. So under Theme 4, Parks Victoria has delivered over a little over $3 million of operations, which has been on-ground and aerial delivery to protect high biodiversity values within the footprint. But further funds have also been used for capacity building with traditional owners. With Parks Victoria, this has been with the likes of Mudgee, Glawak and Tamarong. Operations have focused also on aerial and ground shooting for large herbivore control, baiting and trapping for feral pigs and foxes, weed control, exclusion fencing and feral horse management. So this has required great collaboration with DELWP and the traditional owners to coordinate the delivery. And Parks Victoria have received a further $2.8 million to continue this work until 30th of June this year. And then there is another $7.4 million that's coming through from the state and federal government for the 12 months after that. So the good thing is this is money that can continue for us to build on the works that we're already doing and continue working together to identify where we've got emerging issues as well. So you'll see on the screen there those high value biodiversity areas and critical habitats, and also some of those weight range mammals that we're looking to protect. Oops, sorry, I've just gone one too many. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview of each of the main activity areas, and you've got some pictures there that will help you put this into context. So the aerial shooting activities, there's been over 209,000 hectares that has been repeatedly treated with aerial shooting, mostly for sambar deer. There has also been other target animals such as pigs and foxes, and fallow deer have fallen into this area as well. So the aerial shooting was delivered safely, humanely and professionally across key value parks. In the first 6 months after June last year, so June to December last year, there was 46 days of aerial shooting. As the landscape gradually recovers, more will be known about the biodiversity benefits of this program. However, current results show that during the 10 weeks of the aerial shooting campaign in winter and spring last year, a number of target animals were removed, which equated to 1 target animal every 6.4 minutes of flight time. So there is a definite advantage to doing this, particularly in areas that are difficult to reach on foot. One of the biggest challenges we had in delivering the aerial shooting in particular was the COVID lockdowns that were experienced. So the teams had to work away from their homes and work in bubbles for weeks on end, and getting our contractors in and out of the state created some delays, and innovative thinking was required. It also increased some costs due to accommodation of staff at operations bases over the weekends. The other large part of the herbivore control was the ground shooting campaign that's taken place. And with that, there's been over 160,000 hectares that has been repeatedly covered as well for ground shooting. This operation mostly occurs in the evenings, and the target has been sambar deer, fallow deer, foxes and cats. Predominantly sambar deer is the main target animal, and over 1,000 have been removed. Last year, there was 24 ground shooting operations were delivered across 14 weeks. So that's 81 nights from mid-September to mid-December. And it was across 10 parks in the Parks Victoria estate. We've also had significant ground shooting activity by DELWP, over 57,000 hectares of rainforests of significance, the alpine bogs and fens and nature reserves and joint managed land. This has been on DELWP managed land primarily, and most of this has been in the East Gippsland area. So the baiting and trapping activity has been a significant area to work with for Parks Victoria as well. The pig baiting has taken part in a number of areas that you've seen identified on the screen, nearly 17,000 hectares, and the areas have again primarily been in the East Gippsland area, where we know that pigs are present. Pigs are notoriously difficult to locate. They move, and we're now starting to see pigs coming back into areas that we didn't see them 12 months ago. So we've had to adapt and change our trapping and baiting programs. We're also using cameras with our pig traps, and this gives us an idea to make sure that the populations that we're seeing are what we're expecting. But you will see from the picture that has the green grass with some dirt exposed. This area was pristine one day and then turned over by pigs the next. This is a type of damage they can do very quickly across national park areas. The fox baiting program that we've had has been over 125,000 hectares and across 45 weeks. So each of these programs has had several baiting runs following protocols, and again camera monitoring at a number of bait stations. There's a number of locations on the screen that you can look at, and as an example, the Lake Tyres area, the establishment of this program has been with GLAWAC as well. The weed control work that we've been doing has focused again on 5 communities listed under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And there's also 8 communities listed under the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act that we've been trying to make sure that we're protecting these areas. This has involved contractors going out and spraying weeds, identifying and spraying weeds, and doing a number of other removal techniques where they've felt that has been appropriate. Weed invasion is particularly prevalent after fires because the canopy cover has been reduced, and also there's the nutrients that go into the ground. But we also have problems with erosion and eucalypt invasion into areas that have been burnt as well. Large herbivore browsing on not just new native plants that are coming up, but also some weeds, and the pugging of the ground that occurs is not helpful. There's a number of different areas listed that you can see that have been treated. And I'll just pick up on two there that Parks Victoria have looked at. One is Kuitong Creek, which is key habitat for the Burralong frog. So it's important that we make sure that we provide good habitat, as this frog's endangered under the Commonwealth Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. The other area in the northeast is Pheasant Creek, where Pheasant Creek is a site of considerable floristic importance and is the only known location for the endemic Shelley leek orchid. The reserve's also unique for its complex montane swamps, bogs and riparian woodlands, which are also protected under the EPBC Act. DELWP's focus, as I said before, has been on rainforests of significance, and this work is ongoing, not just in the next 12 months, but also for a number of years after that. Exclusion fencing is the last of the activities I'll talk about today, where we had 2 exclusion fences that were erected. The one at Pheasant Creek, which I just spoke about, is a partial exclusion fence, which means that critical weight range mammals can still pass in and under these fences, but it keeps out the herbivores, deer and feral horses that graze these areas. And the other fence is at the new species wetland. Cultural heritage assessments were undertaken at both of these sites before the fences were put in, and cultural heritage assessment is a big part of the work that Parks Victoria does whenever we're doing any land disturbance, and we work closely with our traditional owners in that respect. The aim of these fences was, as I said, the partial inclusion fence for the wet riparian zone at Pheasant Creek, and then also a full exclusion fence at the new species wetland. The Pheasant Creek fence was just over 5 hectares, and the new species wetland fence was just under 10 hectares in size, so it gives you an idea of these. The last area to touch on is around the monitoring and evaluation. Long-term monitoring evaluation is now being built into some of the programs. Initially, we were in a very reactive space and this wasn't our focus, but as we're moving forward, we need to understand the benefit and impact of the work we're doing. So gathering information for future programs is really critical in what we're doing. What we do know, though, is the staff who are out and about, and also our aerial teams, are reporting an increase in wildlife sightings, and also greater canopy cover and native plant regrowth within the targeted areas. You'll see there's a few dot points on the screen there that talks about some of the monitoring that's going on. As part of the ground shooting, there was 53 surveillance and long-term monitoring cameras which were replaced. These have been part of a previous trial and burnt in the fires. So it was great to get out and replace those, but also update some of the technology that had been used back in 2015 and then completed in 2019. There was also 3 wallow cameras as part of this study as well. We're doing 12 monthly aerial shooting impact assessments where there's flying over looking at the impact of deer on some of the open areas, the grasslands, that we have noticed a significant reduction in deer activity in those areas. There's also thermal imagery. The Alps Feral Horse Aerial Survey is underway at the moment, and this information will also lead into the Victorian Deer Control Strategy 2020 that has recently been released and will be funded long term. So thank you. That gives you, as I said, a high-level snapshot, not specific detail, but I'm happy to answer questions later. But if you are after more information, please go to the 3 websites that are listed on the screen. The first one is the Parks Victoria. The second is the DELWP website, and the third is the federal government bushfire recovery website. And you'll find storybooks and maps on those sites. I would also like to acknowledge the collaboration and the partnership in delivery from the North East CMA, but also the East Gippsland CMA, Trust for Nature and private landholders. So thank you. Tina, I'll hand back to you there, and we'll see what comes up in a Q&A session.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. Yes, We will leave questions till later, but I have a burning desire to ask you, how was that funded? Did some of that come from the federal government's post-fire environmental response funding programs?
Yeah, the work that's going to be done in the next 12 months includes federal funding, but the work that's been done in the previous 12 months is state government funding.
Thank you very much. Our second presenter is Brett Mills. Now, Brett is a Trust for Nature Senior Conservation Officer, and he'll be talking on the topic of deer control on protected private land. So I'd like to hand over to Brett now. Thank you.
Thanks, Tian, and thanks, Deirdre. I'll just attempt to start my screen share. So, hope that's up for everyone. Yeah, look, this really does follow on from what Deirdre has been speaking about. Deer control on protected private land. So a little bit about Trust for Nature. I know Amelia has already spoken a little about Trust for Nature, but Trust for Nature, hang on, I've just lost stuff here, sorry. Yeah, Trust for Nature helps landholders permanently protect their bush through a conservation covenant that's on title. And this slide is of a fire-affected covenant that we're undertaking deer control. It's up in the Wongarabel Valley. And look, as Deirdre mentioned, there was the public land deer control is pretty much a broad landscape approach. But with Trust for Nature, we work on private land, and it is a very much a targeted individual approach. It's not going to do it. Oh, there we go, landholders. So, yeah, look, again, Trust for Nature helps landholders permanently protect their bush through conservation covenant. Goodness, it's done it again. Sorry for the technicality here. Look, there was 46 covenants affected by the fires in our north and east during the 2019-20 fires. And our goal again is to look after our landholders and the regeneration of the bush that they protect. We're also working with adjoining landholders and linking properties to maximise these outcomes. Here we go. Sambar deer are the primary target for the program, and understanding their behaviour and ecology is critical to optimise the effectiveness of a control program, particularly for private land. This is known as profiling. One source of information is from game cameras and can help with estimating deer numbers and the resident population's social dynamics. These two photos here really tell quite a bit of a story. The right-hand photo is of a young hard antler stag, and he's actively breeding that hind. In the background, there's a subordinate stag that's non-threatening. That hind will end up isolated after she's bred from the group. And as that, on the left-hand side, that larger velvet stag, when he goes into hard antler, he'll basically kick away that smaller stag, and the whole dynamics of the whole area on that bit of private property will change. And this is like gold information for the contractors that are looking at controlling on these small properties.
Excuse me, Brett, can you just speak up a little?
Sure. Can everyone hear me a bit better now? So look, sambar deer are the primary target. There is a few fallow deer, but primary target for the program. And understanding their behaviour and ecology is critical to optimising the effectiveness of any control program. And we know this is profiling. One source of information is from game cameras and can help with estimating deer numbers and dynamics. It's done it again for me. Anyway, the long-term survival of plants and the process of recruitment is complex. So rainfall events, weather, other browsers and weeds can all make a difference to how it ends up. The end game can change dramatically with just one small adjustment. The removal of sambar is at a critical stage after fire could make a huge difference to the long-term survival of some of these plants. Okay.
We're just asking, it's working all right? Because if it doesn't, we can always get Suzanne to line it up and take it over. So
unfortunately, it's got quite clunky and I can't shift one screen to the other. So yeah, I'm slowly getting there. Hope everyone can still see.
We're ahead of time, so there's no big panic.
Okay. Yeah, look, so we're working with burnt and unburnt areas. So unburnt areas can become a refuge for all flora and fauna post-fire. So you can see in this first photo on the left, there's a little fern coming up in a wet area after fire, and those small plants can really get smashed directly after fire. The middle photo is of a coppicing bunch of trees post-fire. You can see it's rubbed and that tree could easily disappear. And the right-hand photo is of a refuge area, and you can pretty much see everything green within reach of sambar deer has been removed. And of course, that highly threatens those flora and fauna in that area. It worked this time. Except, hang on 2 seconds. Yes, so look, I undertake deer population assessments at each site, which forms the basis of an operation plan that optimises the most efficient and effective removal plan. And look, you can see from these photos, there's wallows, rubs, footprints, droppings, bedding areas, and rut stands. And again, all this evidence comes together to tell a story for each specific property as to where the deer are. And look, again, that is a gold bit of information for the contractors that have to deal with these niche deer control problems. So, no, it's not going to do it. Yes, it is. We've been working on the Far East, as you can see, and in some small areas. There's been 800 hectares treated. The Lakes unit is one, the Bindi unit, the Marlow unit, and the Wongarabel unit. Generally, private land is small parcels, and there's always a lot to be organised. There's governor and council orders have to be sourced, project authorisations, and specialist contractors also have to be sourced to suit these private land parcels. They all have restricted areas and times available for deer control. Holidays, neighbours, police, weather conditions, and contractors all have to be costed into any one-day deer control. And you can see on this photo here, there's 4 covenant parcels in one unit, and you can understand the logistics of putting together all their agreements and picking a day to suit neighbours as well for just one day's deer control. So yeah, look, facilitation is a big thing. As you can see on the left, there's a couple of Covenantors, Robyn, Virginia from the Wongarabel Valley, and they've been fantastically supportive of the program, as most others have been. The centre photo is of me with some contractors sorting out a deer control program along with agency staff. And on the far right, there's Tess and Amelia, our Trust for Nature Conservation Officers in Bensdale, and they've been doing a fantastic job with monitoring, post-fire monitoring through habitat hectare assessments. And of course, that's a valuable tool in understanding how the change will be post-culls. Oops, nope, here we go. So 54 deer so far have been taken from the small group, and pretty much there's been an absence of deer from all of the properties being assessed, which is a fantastic outcome. Ongoing surveillance will have to be part of the program for some months, which will trigger any further control programs on the properties. But as you can see, plants are returning in very strongly and with great diversity. And our redneck wallaby mate there is pretty happy with his new home post-fire. And what can you say? Landholders, this is Max from the Wongarabel Valley, and post-fire his property has changed dramatically. It's very rich now without the pressure of deer hammering all those young plants, and he's very happy. And that's just a comment from Max. And thanks, team. I think Paul's next.
Thanks very much. That's great, Brett. And it's terrific to be hearing such a positive story with such positive results, even though the process involves death and destruction. We're all familiar with that, but for conservation, it's a great outcome. Just quickly, I wouldn't mind asking you where the funding has been coming from for your program as well.
It's through the Theme 4 funding. So yeah, state government.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks so much, Brett. Our third speaker is Paul Harvey. Now, Paul is also a Trust for Nature Senior Conservation Officer, and he'll be talking on the topic of post-fire challenges and opportunities on private land. And in his spare time, Paul's also the current president of the East Gippsland Conservation Management Network. So thanks very much. Over to Paul.
Hey, hello there. Let me just get myself all ready and escape out of there, and I'll just share screens. This will start with a screen sharing. Do you want to continue? Yes. Screen 1, share, and there we go. Okay. Right. So this is I'm just going to look at a few properties that I've been working on prior to the fires and immediately afterwards, and the challenges and opportunities that they've given me. And I'm doing quite a lot of weed control on a number of private properties, typically in the east of East Gippsland. And the first one we're going to look at is a property in that's Gypsy Point, just north of Malakuta, owned by a lovely couple called the Lortzes, who'd contacted us to have a chat with what was going to happen with their big bush block there that's indicated. The blue line indicates the creek line, which we'll come across. So the opportunity here was to engage with the landowners with a view to getting them to covenant at some point in the future, and to facilitate, if you like, relationship building with them. We began a program of weed control. They had some lovely swampy vegetation, tree ferns, sort of Garnier swamp trying to turn into something rainforest derived hard up against the river, but some really good native vegetation. Had a bit of an arum lily in a number of areas. So our engagement, our opportunity was working on the arum lily problems there. And a wonderful sight, as you can see, gorgeous little golden green bell frog here. Here I am on a 30-degree day, marvelous, engaging with the wildlife in the swamp, as you do, and working on their arum lilies and also some blackberry. But things were going really well. The landowners were very happy with the work. We'd put in perhaps 5-person days on the arum lilies, really cleaned up that excellent swampy gully. And then the fire came through and the response was quite extraordinary. So here came the challenge. This is what the swamp area turned into afterwards. Now that's red inkweed. So we know it pops up lice disturbance, particularly fires, but there had been no sign of this plant on this property. There was no appreciable fire history on this property, nor because of its position out at Gypsy Point was there any real fire history in the area. So where the hell did this come from? And it basically was an entire creek of it. Now, I haven't seen this anywhere else. You know, we all get these fire response weeds cropping up, but this was just an astonishing carpet running for hundreds and hundreds of meters. So on a limited budget, the challenge frankly overcame me. And this is one of the decisions you have to make when you have a limited budget, and I'm sure we all do. I had multiple opportunities to deal with in the post-fire area. Looking at this, I made the decision that I wouldn't continue to invest in there for the simple reason that I didn't have the budget to be able to deal with that weed. And I'm assuming you couldn't just leave it because it was choking out everything else. And whether or not it passes in time within a year or two, its impact will remain. And also it presents a future liability. So it was a really tricky one to have to deal with there. I couldn't figure out how to spray that out without killing what was left of the native fauna and flora, which some fern species, there was some rare stuff in there, was beginning to regenerate. So in the end, I passed on it and used my resources elsewhere, as I felt I'd get a better return for the investment. Moving on to the second property owned by a lovely couple called the Bucklands, not so far away from the first one. This is down towards Bucklands Jetty, just north of Malakuta, beautiful area. And for anybody who's walked from Bucklands Jetty along the pathway there on the right-hand side of that block that's indicated, as you go into the national park and the path there, you've probably looked to your left and seen what looked like a really nice rainforest gully. So here the opportunity again was to engage with the landowners. This was shortly before the fire started as part of our biodiversity response program, and to engage with them through our weed control program to help clean up that sort of rainforest gully, again with a view to getting them to talk to us about covenanting in the long run. It's not a big site, but it's a very high quality site. And we're also, at least in the meantime, looking at them coming around to the idea of fencing out the stock permanently from this gully. Not that the stock went in there much, but the cleared area at the base of that gully was trying to turn back into the rainforest it once was. So great vegetation, warm temperate rainforest, rare plants. Here's a couple. There's a fringed helmet orchid at the back there, and in the front is a Lobelia purpurescens or white root, both rare in that area. And this is what the property looked like before the fire. It's a proper jungle, really gorgeous. Landowners not interested in it particularly, of course, but I was. Number of rare species in there. And then this is pretty much the next shot when I went after the fire, same place, very, very badly impacted by the fire. It ripped through there. And so the challenge after the fires was not so much the immediate impact as bad as that was. This is after a few months post-fire. I didn't go back immediately because there was no point. But when I went back a few months later, things were beginning to shift. And as things began to take off, then we've got a new challenge here. It's not just the fact that there's weeds there. That's the second time we went. I don't know if you can get the idea of just how much the growth is taking off. And there's weeds mixed in there. And you can always make a case for leaving some weeds maybe choked out, thistles, for instance, perhaps. But what we found, it's saying in this picture here, on the larger plant sticking up is a rare plant called a bolwarra or a Eupomacia larina. And right next to it is inkweed. Now this is, I deliberately took this photo because you could actually visualize quite easily what was going on there. And again, this is just on the edge of the burned area. The blackberries popping out, but you've got other native stuff coming up there, a bit of Sigus Beckia or Indian weed behind it, amongst other plants and small ferns. Here's another one that popped up in post-fire. It's a rare plant, Hiberti dentata. But now my challenge here was how not to knock the decent rare plants or the native vegetation in general, whilst dealing with the emergent post-fire weeds. But as it began to turn back into a post-fire jungle, then it became very, very difficult to actually accurately target the weeds that were coming up. And I'm sure other people have had this problem. So it's me and a friend of mine, John, a contractor, working with me with just a few litres of spray in a backpack, stumbling up and down the slopes here. And it was, although the slopes aren't big in the area, they are quite steep and the soil's very crumbly and friable. So we were just staggering about trying to just get the threatening weeds that we deemed. So that was pretty much blackberry, red inkweed, and a little bit of bridal creeper had suddenly emerged as well, which hadn't been there before, not that I've noticed. And that challenge is going to continue. It still represents an opportunity in the sense that it's a great spot, it's worth defending, bunch of rare plants. But perhaps other people found that, as I did, that after the initial response of the weeds to the fire wasn't that bad. It was with the regular follow-up rain, and once we began to get towards the end of spring, it wasn't even the beginning of spring that I found, it was the end of spring moving into the summer heat, it went nuts. Which brings me on to the next property, which was, this is a small covenanted block. You can see Goongerah up to the top right of the picture. So there's 3 private properties just there out on a limb and surrounded by public land. So we have a covenant on this particular area. And the opportunity here, somewhat unusually, came from the actual impact of the fires which ripped through here. A lot of damage in that area. Martins Creek, site, a national site of rainforest significance just to the south of that block, sorry, take it back, just to the south of that picture, was very heavily impacted, and that's a national site of rainforest significance, you know. So this is what our property looked like before, but also if you look closely down towards the right hand bottom of the picture and the next one, you get an idea there was an awful lot of blackberries in there because the property has an absent landowner who's actually never visited the block as far as I know. She just bought it because she wanted to do something good for the planet for the future, and well, good on her. We had a serious blackberry problem in there, and it was largely coming from an adjacent Vic Roads stack site, as they're known, where they go and dump their stuff. And in fact, the eastern sort of third of that block of ours was almost impregnable with blackberries, and we didn't know what we were going to do with it to even get into it. So the fires hammered the blackberry, and so the opportunity arose. It allowed us to access all parts of the site for the first time, to get in there before it all really kicked off. So we undertook a post-fire spraying program, which accidentally took in the underlineated Vic Road stack site. We did advise them afterwards, and I asked them to join in, and I've only just got a reply from them after many, many months, and at least 2 follow-up emails from me, which kind of indicates their sort of interest in that sort of thing. Allowing us to get into the site. So here the blackberry's been completely repressed, and it didn't really begin to kick off until the end of the spring, which meant that I could get in there with my contractor and really work on that area that was becoming, you know, pointless to have under covenant, if you see what I mean. So it's a strange sort of opportunity that was presented by such destruction. That was here's an example of the emergent blackberry, and which we pounced on. We've been back about 3 times. It's now, of course, beginning to take off. Here's one of my monitoring points from a termite mound, and I went back there yesterday. Here it is a few months later. You begin to see what's happening, and the termite mound is now not visible. And I've even got a couple of other monitoring points with indicated with star pickets with yellow caps on, and I sprayed them pink as well to stand out. I can't find them. You'd need a machete now to get in there. So it's good in the sense that the thick growth will choke out many of the weed species, but as you can see, it's a pain to try and get in to knock off any remnant blackberry, although hopefully the opportunity presented to us by the fire has conversely enabled us to, in the long term, improve the quality of this site. And this fella who I found on the site was still quite happy and hanging on in there. That's a bronze rock skink. So yeah, hopefully it'll come back. It is. That's the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, I'll take them now if we're ahead of time, or I'm happy to answer any later on.
We're probably going to take them later, I think, Paul. Okay. So, but it's wonderful to hear you say that there was such a good opportunity presented by such destruction. That's really what other groups have found as well. So, yeah, there are a few positives that have come out of the fire, and this is one of them, the opportunity to gain some leverage over some intransigent weeds. So I'll now move on to introduce our next speaker, who is Andrew Briggs from North East Catchment Management Authority. Andrew is a senior project officer who's worked with North East Catchment Management Authority for 17 years. He will be speaking on the topic of recovery of riparian areas, the challenges and long-term approach needed. Thank you to Andrew.
Thank you. Now, what has happened here? Do I want to continue? Yes. Sorry. Now, yeah, g'day everyone. Thanks for the introduction. Can everyone see can you see my presentation there? Very good. Just checking. Yeah, so just talking about our fire recovery program in the northeast of Victoria. For people that are outside the region, the northeast CMA area covers basically everything that flows into the Murray River, north of the Divide and east of about Wangaratta. So particularly as the fires were impacted was in that upper Murray area, and also down around Omeo and Kabungra as well. Like everywhere, or similar to everywhere, New Year's Eve just tore through the valleys. The particularly impacted waterways up our stretch was the Cudgewar Creek and the Narrial Creek and the Thoudler Creek. The map you can see there, the darker red obviously indicates the higher intensity where the canopy was totally lost, which for the Narrial Creek and the Thoudler Creek was over 50% of the entire catchment had lost all of its canopy. And I think there was only about 2% of those catchments that were unburnt or only lightly burnt. So yeah, major impacts on those waterways. And as we know with waterways, that they can go into a state of suspended animation after a fire where everything sort of looks kind of okay, and then inevitably you get a rainfall event. And I've just thrown this quick graph in here of the discharge of Stacey's Bridge, which is on the Narrial Creek, just as the Narrial leaves the sort of national park area and gets out towards the farmland. And you can see these spikes, and each one of those spikes is a rain event. They started at the end of January and then pretty much evenly one a month or so after that, with a major one on the 30th of April, which caused all sorts of mayhem, which I'll talk further about. But the significance is this kind of flash flooding in these steep, sort of not high altitude, but very high energy catchments. You know, flooding's not uncommon, but what's uncommon here is that we're talking from rainfall events that were in the order of maybe 10 to 20 mils and not 200 mils, which is sort of what would normally cause that sort of flooding. Instantly, we started seeing these major debris or colluvial flows out into, this is on the Cudgewar Creek, just rock and rubble coming out of every single gully, completely smothering habitats, completely, altering the way rivers tick. Hundreds of thousands of excess cubic metres of gravel and sediment into the system. This is the Narrial Creek, where the river changed course completely from the left-hand side of the stream to the right-hand side of the stream, literally, overnight, because of the deposition of gravel and sediments through these areas. And then there's also where you get major debris blockages. The debris here in this case is gone, but causes these major sort of outflanking and meander migrations, which, destroys habitat. When you look at this river, everyone sees the erosion there, but also what you might see is that it's now a completely homogeneous bed form with minimal in-stream variability or habitats across that whole shingle bank there now. There was a almost total loss of fish populations in the Cudgewar and Thoudler and the Narrial Creeks across that area. The Cudgewar seemed to be particularly heavily hit, with almost wiped out the Murray cod population, which was thriving in that area, with many fish observed up to a metre, dragged up on the banks by foxes and what have you. It's really devastating, and the heartbreak amongst the community is profound and through to this day. And stench of it at the time. So I've just got a clip here, hopefully it'll play. This is the flow out of one small gully that a landholder captured after about approximately 15 mils of rain in January straight after that. So the sheer volume of sediment and mud, and as I say, this is literally just one gully that's coming out. And the sad thing is that these sorts of flows, whilst they were the worst early on, it's not uncommon to hear reports of gullies that have missed pockets of rainfall over the last 12 months, and all of a sudden they're still letting go now. So we're still this problem, whilst we're not getting the ash and the charcoal and things, but the instability right up in these catchments is pretty profound and lingers on. And this is one of the defining features, I suppose, of this program, of our bushfire recovery program, is the challenges and the inaccessibility of a lot of these issues, because you inherently want to go right to the source and deal with these problems at the top, but the country is so inaccessible and it's so impractical, also costly to try and address these things. So you end up inevitably forcing a situation where you have to work at the end of the pipe of mitigating the impacts of these flows, because there's very little often that you can do to prevent them on that kind of scale. So we had a significant investment from the Victorian state government under their fire recovery programs, roughly $3 million, which was a tremendous program for waterway recovery, public asset protection, and the long-term recovery and improvement of riparian aquatic ecosystems. And it was also a chance within that program to review things from a more strategic perspective and maybe do things a little bit differently as well, and work with landholders for not just addressing some of the point issues, but strategically, is this an opportunity to move forward with a different way of managing your farm or your waterways or what have you. So that comes with a lot of opportunity, and it comes with a lot of challenges, because when you're working so closely with people, as I'm sure a lot of people here presenters understand, it's not new to any of us. People are pretty rattled. Their properties have been lost in many cases up here. Their houses have been lost, all their livestock. So to then turn around and start saying, well, how about we do something different with your creek? It's not a high priority for them straight away. So it's a long-term conversation. And that's one of the challenges with funding. And it's not a criticism, it's just a reality, but of short-term programs when you're dealing with people that are really rattled, and catchments that are dealing with major long-term instabilities. From a waterway, just as an observation, from a waterway perspective, there's a sense that recovery, sorry, I'll backtrack a bit. After a bushfire, there's these two words bandied about: response and recovery. Response is sort of putting the wet stuff on the red stuff. Let's get the flames out. Once the smoke's over, then all of a sudden we're into recovery mode. As it is with many weed issues and things, particularly with waterways in particular, we're still responding. The responses of the catchment to the post-fire situation don't really happen until after it rains or for a long time. So we're still very much responding to new impacts of the fire than before we can even head for recovery in some of these catchments. So we work very closely with landholders and other stakeholders, trying to negotiate those long-term outcomes. Landholders sign up to agreements and new perspectives and new ways of managing, often Crown land frontages, not always. Sometimes it's freehold, but often there's Crown frontages involved. That's a whole other story. And just about maximising our bang for our buck. So we do a lot of work in-house, but we also get in some targeted consultancies or engineering advice for some of the key things. Geomorphology reports, the Narrial Creek is one that the geomorphology there has been fundamentally altered for the last 100 years, but now that the fire's happened, it's really highlighted some of the systemic issues within the system. And it's an opportunity to have that conversation with landholders and learn a bit more. The Cudgewell Creek also, there's a major fishway being designed to help get fish back up into the Cudgewell Creek. A whole raft of works. Fencing and revegetation are you know, must-haves. Nothing happens unless there's a fencing and a revegetation offset. But structural interventions for managing the instabilities, but also targeted habitat installations. And we've also learned from picking and choosing from many decades of river management in our areas, in others, that you can actually have your cake and eat it too. You can stabilise erosion and major instabilities, but not necessarily at the expense of in-stream or riparian habitats. It's just a couple of examples. This site here hasn't been fenced or revegetated yet. This is immediately post the structural works. It was a similar bend to that image I showed before of, you know, a mass erosion event, huge amounts of debris blocked up in the river. The debris was cleared. Timber that had fallen or was salvaged. We worked very closely with our partners with DELWP and Parks and Vic Roads and landholders to salvage as much timber as we can from roadsides and bushfire areas, and then incorporate that timber into the waterways, with still some use of rock for helping for stability. But the use of timber is absolutely fundamental for the long term. It helps grade the sediment over time, creates scour opportunities for scour, and obviously for habitat for fish and aquatic species and animals that use that area. But it really is an opportunity also to slow down the energy of some of these really high energy streams, to break that energy up and create velocity refuge and little niches within those reaches that were otherwise just blasted open. Survey is, you know, ongoing survey is a major scientific opportunity in this area, and the Arthur Ryler Institute and arm of DELWP that do a lot of the fish survey across the state. We've engaged them a few times now since the fires regularly come up and do repeat survey in areas. This magnificent fish here was near the mouth of the Cudgewell Creek and the Murray River. They actually caught two cod over a metre and other large and small Murray cod in the bottom end of the Cudgewell Creek, which was really, really important because, you know, this is only 6-7 months after the fires, and there was evidence of cod trying to push back up into the Cudgewell Creek where there'd been such devastation. And so, you know, the significance and importance of getting those fish back into the river and seeing what they can do naturally. There is, of course, a lot of pressure amongst the community and fishermen, of course, and everyone's for restocking. But restocking is okay if it's done right, but often you still need to stack the odds in the favour of the natural recovery processes and let the river recover at its own time as the food and the habitat becomes available for some of these guys. Right down to the little fellas, this is a river blackfish. Obviously, that's the other end of the spectrum of the big Murray cod, but, you know, we're trying to get all of these guys back as quickly as we can. And the amazing thing is, you can see by the tummy on this blackfish, the food availability, whilst these waterways were devastated and fish, you know, ostensibly obliterated for much of their length, as they recover, the food that is there is abundant for the fish that have survived. So the fish that have survived often do really, really well. In sort of agricultural terms, they've got the run of a big paddock. You know, they've got a lot of food and a lot of habitat for a very small number of fish. So the ones that are there tend to do very well. This is just a quick schematic of the fishway that we'll be building on the Cudgewell Creek. There's a weir, a barrier on the Cudgewell Creek, an old historic structure that is required to still be in place. We can't just remove it. And it's only about 1.5 kilometres, or maybe a whisker further from the junction with the Murray. So to have a major blockage right at the bottom end of the system is obviously a major inhibiting factor to the long-term recovery of the Cudgewell Creek. And so what we'll be building, and this is just a snapshot out of the draft plans, we'll be building this next summer. Once we've got everything in place, and it'll be a rock ramp style fishway that will be able to move both large fish, as we saw, and also the small fish back up into that system.
Mm.
Volunteers, everyone's just so engaged. It's amazing to see in the Upper Murray. I'm sure other people have seen a similar thing. The fishermen are just beside themselves with the Upper Murray was a bit of a mecca for fishing and for native fish, as well as trout, of course. And it's a huge thing for the economy up that way, as well as the part of the, it's inbuilt in the psyche of the community up there. They pride themselves on their rivers and the fishing that they've always enjoyed. So we've actually just last week had a tree planting, not just a tree planting day, but I lined up a week of tree planting for them, and we had so many volunteers, they finished it in 4 days. So they put 3,500 trees, over 3,500 trees in just a couple of days, and that included disappearing at lunchtime for a fish and a couple of good examples as well. So
Thanks, Andrew. Your
that
time's actually up.
Oh, righto. Well, I've got the one last slide here, which goes for 10 seconds, and that's in January. So that's a year after the fires in the Narrial Creek, and it was just great to see a platypus back there compared to what the flows that we were getting, what it looked like. So I was finished anyway. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Andrew. That's amazing. Again, shocking sediment events, but some positive signs of recovery. Thanks so much for that. And fantastic that the Victorian government has responded quickly with the funding for that program. So we're now actually going to have a little bit of a break for 5 minutes, and Robyn Edwards is going to introduce us if you want to be guided. No, you don't have to do all those stretches, but she'll help us relax and stretch during this 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Tian. Yes, please choose an exercise or not. But before you do that, if you need to go to the toilet or grab a glass of water, take this 5 minutes to go out and do that. And we'll be starting back in definitely 5 minutes. For those of you that want to stay online, I'm going to run you through some breathing and stretching to relax, re-energize and refocus for the last session of our webinar today. So for those of you who are joining in, we'll just start by becoming aware of our breath, taking a normal breath in, and as if you're blowing out a candle, a longer, slower, deeper breath out. So just take a minute to breathe in normally, and as if you're blowing a candle out, a longer, deeper, slow breath. And now on your next breath in, taking a full breath in and raising your arms up to the ceiling, and on your breath out, breathing out. On your next breath in, breathing in, holding, and in time with the breath out, lowering your arms. Breathing in, raising your arms up to the front, holding, and lowering down. And one more to the side. Big breath in this time, holding, and as you breathe out, blowing it out and letting them drop. And once more, breathing in, a big deep breath in, holding, and letting them drop. Okay, we're going to stand, and we're going to do the same exercise. And if you've got good balance, as you breathe in and raise your arms up to the sides, come up on your tippy toes, looking straight ahead so you've got focus to not fall over, or just stay standing flat on your heels if you don't have good balance. So coming up, breathing in, raising up, and stretching right up, stretch to the left and a stretch to the right, and coming down. Once more, breathing in, stretching up to each side And stretching down. Then on the next breath in, lock your hands behind your back and breathing in, bring your shoulder blades together, arms back behind you and giving those shoulders, hunching over too long at the computer and releasing. Once more, breathing in, stretching the arms back behind your back and releasing. And we'll counter bend that by bringing your arms out in front and stretching your shoulder blades open wide. And drop. And once more, bringing them out in front, opening those shoulder blades and releasing down. Okay, shaking your arms, shaking your legs, shaking your feet, and come back sitting down again. Okay, if you're comfortable shutting your eyes, we'll just finish off now, shutting your eyes or looking low if you don't want to shut your eyes. We're just going to take a minute to become aware of the breath. Feeling the effect of the stretches on your body, your toes, your feet, your back. And aware of the breath as it moves in and out. Thank you, everyone. I hope you're feeling a bit more energised and focused, and I'll be handing back to Tian now. Thanks, Tian.
Thanks, Robyn. How lovely. We're all more relaxed. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Tom Crook. Tom is from the East Gippsland Conservation Management Network, and he's a passionate forest ecologist and educator of 20 years experience. He's worked for the Victorian state government, private and community environment sectors, and has spent the past 5 years as the program's delivery manager with the not-for-profit East Gippsland Conservation Management Network. So take it away, Tom. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. And a bit of a presentation today about some of the work that our organisation has been doing, but I'll just pay respects to the traditional custodians of the land that I work on, Gunai Kurnai, Monero and Bidwell people, and acknowledge that their sovereignty has never been ceded. So the East Gippsland Conservation Management Network is a community-run, partnership-based, tenure-blind, incorporated environmental charity, and we're basically on a mission to improve conservation outcomes for rare, threatened and endangered plants, animals and communities in East Gippsland. So I'll just start by acknowledging too that the forested landscapes of East Gippsland aren't in pristine condition. So we haven't come into this bushfire disaster and the recovery process in a way that would be optimal. The forests are already experiencing a range of threats and stresses from deer to exotic plants and other animals, climate change, of course, logging, changing fire regimes. So this further complicates the work of trying to assist that natural recovery process. But I've got a couple of major projects I'll talk about today. The first one is called Owls from the Ashes. And we chose owls as a focal species because we recognise that they're quite probably disproportionately affected by fire because of the way fire impacts elements of their critical habitat. So particularly the hollow-bearing trees that they use to nest and breed in, but also their foraging habitat, the understory vegetation and the prey abundance. So our project is really looking at owl occupancy to further inform future forest management decision-making. Well, that's the idea. So understanding where owls are after the fires relative to where they were before, and looking also at supplementary habitat for particular masked owl species. And also increasing the capacity and opportunities for government and community land managers to work in partnership for those biodiversity outcomes. So we started the Owls from the Ashes project by using Victorian Biodiversity Atlas data. We looked at four main owl species. You can see the three there, powerful mast and sooty owls. That's their distribution, which we clipped using GIS software for the fire footprint itself. So that's the overall picture of where owls were within the fire ground before the fire. We needed a way to prioritise our survey effort because we can't possibly survey every single location where there are previous records. So we did that again by using GIS software and built a bit of a density picture or a model of where the highest density records were. prior to the fire using that same biodiversity atlas information. And we then looked at the fire severity mapping produced by the department, because there's a pretty good understanding from previous research that the likelihood of owl habitation in fire affected areas that have been severely burnt is pretty low. So we really need to focus our survey effort outside of those severely burnt areas. So with all those things in mind, we were able to hedge our bets on about 211 sites in particular, which we then divided up into sectors to kind of make it more manageable, to hand sectors to other community groups, and working with government departments like the Arthur Ryler Institute to try and get a bit of landscape level coverage for those 4 focal species. So you can see there how those different areas and the different species fell out of that prioritisation process. So this is what the call playback method actually looks like when you do it, which is our principal survey technique. You use a megaphone or a loudhailer. You play the owl calls in sequence and listen and record for a period of time after the calls have been played, in the hope that the owl species will call back to those species calls being broadcast. And some of the time they do, some of the time they don't. And so when they don't, that's followed up with spotlight transect in and around the areas where they've previously been recorded to pick up any animals that may come in to those calls, but that haven't actually vocalized or made any noise. So that we sort of pick them up by using spotlights against a visual identification. So you get a range of species turning up using this technique, greater gliders, yellow-bellied gliders, and a couple of sooty owls, among a range of other species. And this project also looked at how effective artificial habitat was for mast owls in particular. Back in 2017, our organisation put up a range of these owl tanks across the landscape. So this project's also looking at how effective they have been as artificial habitat, but we're still in the process of doing that work. Another major project that we've done in the fire recovery space has been to look at rainforest sites of significance. East Gippsland has the vast majority of rainforests in Victoria. Back in the 80s and 90s, these were all at a state level. The rainforest areas were all mapped and ranked. And you can see by the graph there that East Gippsland certainly has the lion's share. A vast majority of those rainforest sites were subject to the effects of the bushfires. This is what those places look like. This is an example of warm temperate rainforest. That's our lower elevations. And we're talking about those super shady environments that are naturally moist in topographically protected gullies, normally south facing. So it's super shady canopy created by that, super shady environment created by that really thick canopy structure. And the old world species, those rainforest plants that have direct evolutionary lineages back to Gondwanan times. So these things together create a really unique series of environmental conditions that are really found nowhere else in the landscape. And as a function of that, many of the rainforest plants that we find in these areas are in fact obligate or have to live in these rainforest environments, or more or less don't live anywhere else. So these are really biodiversity hotspots, and in East Gippsland, all rainforests are either rare, threatened, or in some cases critically endangered. So rainforests are naturally fire retardant or don't normally burn, but under extreme conditions, of course, unfortunately they do. And this is a rainforest, a national rainforest site of significance at Martins Creek, north of Orbost. You can see while the skeletons of the trees are still there, that rainforest canopy that creates that deep shade has been entirely removed. So the structure's been completely altered. Some rainforests like this one on the east branch of the Errinundra River, which is actually the largest stand of rainforest in Victoria, were much more fortunate. And you can see that the fire came with only within a couple of 100 metres of this rainforest stand, and some pollen records taken from core samples in the ground suggest the vegetation has been pretty stable in this particular location for about 6,000 years, or in fact back to the last glaciation. So this is a little area called Fairy Dell. It's a state rainforest site of significance just near Bruthen. We chose to focus on this site because it has a a range of natural values and a whole lot of community interest from Briggs and Landcare Group, and there's also a little section managed by Parks Victoria. So the area itself is about 1,400 hectares. You can see the rainforest there in bright green, and then a little area down to the south west in green highlight, which is the reserve managed by Parks, where there's a little loop track. So it's a pretty significant little spot, the range of natural values, rare plants at the edge of their geographic range, and a whole lot of other species of interest. It was subject to really high intensity fire on the 31st of January. This image shows the fire extent of that Ferrydale rainforest site of significance. So you can see about half the overall area, about half the rainforest stands were subject to the effects of the fire. This next image shows the fire intensity. So again, about half of the area that was burnt was subject to the highest level of fire severity. And so it was of great concern to the local community, who have become very attached to this place, how that rainforest was going to recover. So they reached out to us and we developed a project together along with Parks Victoria, obtained some funding from Landcare Australia to help Ferrydale recover. And that paid for some wildlife cameras, again, some GIS work and some mapping. It'll pay for a new interpretation sign and some other things. We ran a bunch of workshops in there. And basically we're looking at tracking the trajectory of the recovery and trying to manage the threats in that site as we go. So this is what it looked like before the fire. This is the same location immediately afterwards. This image is taken only a couple of weeks post-fire. If you just pay attention to those three skinny trees in the middle of the image, you can see there are those same three skinny trees about 2 weeks after the fire. So you can see the effects are quite profound for these rainforest areas. The fire removes a vast majority of the biomass, particularly that deep shade casting canopy and most of the vegetation at ground level. But this image is taken only 4 months after the fire, or 6 months after the fire, and you can see it's actually quite a rapid rate of recovery there in the understory. That's mostly kangaroo apple and some native passion fruit vine, which is a rare plant growing up that giant lily pilly. So these areas do start to recover quite rapidly. We did some monitoring of the wildlife that was in there with the Landcare Group and picked up lyrebirds and brush-tailed possums and wallabies, and this is all within a couple of months of the fire. So even though the area was subject to high intensity fire, those animals were actually able to recolonize quite rapidly. Suspect that might be a black panther, we're not sure. And of course, sambar deer, which pose a significant threat to the natural recovery processes of these rainforest areas by altering the species composition by selective browsing and killing some of the rainforest canopy trees that survived the fire as well. So within a couple of months, you can see that's one of our camera images. The understory recovered to the extent where camera monitoring that location anyway wasn't really serving much of a purpose anymore. So we also did a bunch of weed mapping. So this image shows our weed transects and a bunch of photo point monitoring. So you can see that's one of our photo points, and we'll use that to track overall species, rainforest condition through time. Here's an image straight after the fire and then almost 1 year on. And the same thing on the track on the way in there, and a bit of lowland forest straight after the fire, or 2 weeks, and then 1 year on. We've also got another rainforest recovery project funded by the Ross Trust, looking at, so initially this one involved doing a bunch of GIS prioritization using computer mapping software to prioritize sites. So we looked at 10 sites in particular, and we looked at overall site condition. We looked at the impacts from deer, and we looked at the listed threatened species in each of those locations. And look, these are some of the images of people who have helped us along the way. And the take-home message really here is that rainforest recovery is rapid, but that structural development of the canopy takes a really long time. And we may be lucky if we ever see some of those areas recover to their former extent in our lifetimes. So the other message is that together we can do this. And so we're looking for further funding and additional partnerships and looking to continue this work into the future. Here's a list of our partners, and project assisters. And if you'd like to find out more, you can visit our website and download our latest newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. That's amazing to hear about not only the owls, but the rainforest. And of course, in northern New South Wales, it's a very similar story. So it would be fantastic to see some comparative results between East Gippsland, which has the warm temperate rainforest, and the subtropical rainforest in northern New South Wales, stretching right down. So thank you very, very much.
My pleasure.
We'll go to our next speakers now. We have two Covenantors, Trust for Nature Covenantors, speaking now, John and Robyn Hermans. And John and Robyn will share their experiences of impact and recovery on their 40-hectare property in Clifton Creek, which has been covenanted since 1998. Their topic is an East Gippsland Covenanter's perspective. So thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Tian. You can hear me okay? You can see the picture of the house there? Yep. No, good. Yes, no, this is just a perspective of, as Tian mentioned, about one property and our observations in that time from the fire onwards, and just given an idea of some of the things that's happened here. So I've just broken it up into three sections: the fire as it happened, the botanical response of the vegetation, and our response and things that we've done in order to assist that process. So this shot here of the house is sort of thing that needs to be done in order to minimise the loss of your house in a fire. So this was just the night of the fire before it came. Now I'm not being able to process these pictures. And I'll just, here we go.
Okay, and we have a standby option as well, John, if needed. I believe that Suzanne can upload and progress, but let's just see how it goes. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a bit odd.
You may just be able to click on the image on the side, John, to progress through your slides. In that the small, yeah.
Let's see if that works.
Okay.
We'll go to the next image. That's all. Here we go. Okay. So yeah. Okay. So here's a view of the property and the house where we live. So you get an idea of the forest type surrounding our house and the density of the trees around the house. So you can see there that one would think that would be somewhat of a difficult situation to deal with in a wildfire. And also with that little patch of rainforest in front of the house, which is something that I've been procuring over the last 10 years or so. It's quite thick, but I did in fact have a lot of infrastructure in place to deal with the situation of a fire coming through this property in relation to our assets. So that patch of rainforest in front of the house is still there today. It didn't burn, but clearly, as you will see from this photo here, everything else around certainly did. And it just in this photo here, one thing is worth noting is that the fire on this property did not burn as a crown fire. You can see all the leaves on the upper canopy of the trees there. Some on the far background on the left, you can see some black. That's possibly where you had crown burning. But that's not on our property. The lead up to the fire on this property, the fuel on the ground was absolutely minimal because of the drought, the subsequent drought beforehand. So there wasn't a lot of fuel on the ground, and the fire came at night and there wasn't much wind. But despite that, it was just so dry. That drought-inspired or drought-driven dry situation just made the fire burn for so long, and that's what caused so much damage. So, and it was a ground fire with a bark and stem fire included. This is a shot taken from outside my workshop where you can see all the stems on fire. And we were able to move around in that situation. There was 5 of us. We all stayed to defend ourselves against loss of the house, so we could walk around outside even though the fire was all around us, but always there was a wall to stand behind and lots of sprinklers in close to the house. So there's a shot with the fire almost upon us. One could say it's imminent and it's not far away. So this fire started 5 weeks prior to the day of the fire. We had 5 weeks of intensive preparation for what was coming. So We knew it was coming. We put in place a system to deal with it, and we did. This shot here showing, I might mention here, just a photo on the left there, that large tree that's burnt out and fallen over. That was a solid tree with not a single hollow in it prior to the fire. Nearly all large trees, a metre in diameter, were lost in this fire. It was one of our greatest losses of the large hollow bearing trees, or even trees without hollows for that matter. Photo on the right there was an area in the north of the property looking down the river. You can see behind me there, not much left at all. And yet the last fire on this property was 40 years ago. That area where I'm standing there, or squatting, didn't even burn then. The fire came to a stop at that point, which just goes to show it's everything burned. If anything was dry, it disappeared. So, and in the case of that shot, whole living trees gone. Just a shot here of some of the, a week after the devastation, the main drive along the road along the driveway, and down at the river, which I'll talk about separately. This pair of Lewin honeyeaters, which we caught the next day after the fire, as a pair of fledglings which hadn't succumbed, but their parents were missing. So my daughter Jill reared them, and they successfully ended up flying away, and they're now out there somewhere, hopefully to breed and carry on. So they're a rainforest bird, and they were living in the rainforest in front of the house. So a good news story there. Down at the river, on the Nicholson River, which we have frontage, a kilometre frontage to. This is a very sad occasion to see what's happened here, because this is basically the riparian rainforest. It's a gallery rainforest made up primarily of Canuka, Tristaniopsis, and it did burn as a crown fire, even though the eucalypt forest didn't. And what happened here was the very steep valley this river was in burnt for so long, it cooked the river at the bottom to such a degree that the leaves of the Tristaniopsis just shriveled up and dried until they then burnt as a crown fire. So talk about taking a hit for something which is not even meant to burn at all. It's now coming back from lignotubers, which is nice. And this photo on the right is showing that that's actually after a rain event, 3 weeks after the fire. So it got crown burnt, and then it got a heavy rain event which pulled white ash and mud all over it. And we'll see that in the next shot. This shot of the wombat showing, of course, that they managed to survive in their burrows, which is wonderful. And we're presuming that's where the lyrebirds went, because we have still got lyrebirds on the property. Given the heat of the fire and the severity of it, where the hell did they go? We can only presume they went down wombat burrows, and they survived together. This is showing the terrible effects of a 60 mil rain event 3 weeks after the fire, and we saw that earlier in was it Andrew's up in the northeast there? Andrew's photos there I am with my leg in the river, just pure mud. It wasn't even water at that stage; it was just mud. So how the platypus managed to survive that, and of course so many other invertebrates, we're not sure, but we're starting to see a lot of invertebrates in the water, and there are DNA tracing records to show that suggest that platypus are still in the river. So we've got hope there that may be the case. Some after fire events on the property are we put nearly 3 kilometres of walking tracks in a circuit around the property. You just hired a machine for a weekend and got our hand tools out, and we have this lovely walking track around the property, which would have been very difficult to install any other time. So that was a benefit from being able to achieve that. One spot here at the top end of a gully, which has not only been burnt and then rained upon and then disturbed, you see the calamari, or the incense plant, just coming up thick. And that particular location there, you'll see a bit later, another photo, is just so thick you can't believe, you can't walk through it. So shot with me with the first kangaroo apple. These are the fire response species, which I'll show a few photos of. I can't see those shots on the very far right there, but they're the first calamaria there and the first kangaroo apple. But there's other species such as Muehlenbeckia, what is it, Riticaria. No, it's Muehlenbeckia. What is it? But anyhow, it's forest bindweed.
Calistigia.
Calistigia, yeah, that's right. That is a very important plant which grows, it's a vine which grows primarily as fire response in rainforest, would you believe, which is then covers the ground and covers the area so thickly that it creates a dark shading effect on the ground, which stops eucalypts from sprouting and therefore taking over that which once was a rainforest area. And in a particular gully that I'm revegetating, the Calistegia is actually doing the same thing. It's holding back all other species and allowing what would have been rainforest plants to get re-established. This shot on the far left is, you can see ferns, quite obviously, and I think a long line of them. This is an interesting observation here in that this fern is Caliclinia dubia, which is rainbow fern or just a soft bracken. It was never on the property prior to the fire at all, not known to be there. The spore of that fern landed as a wave of dust across the whole area after the fire and has come up on ash beds. And those ferns you can see there now, they're not there anymore, they've died. They only survive where the habitat suits them. That's just an observation of how plants manage to survive or spread and propagate themselves after fire. The top right there is the rare and threatened species of plant on our property, which is the wallaby bush, Berea lessocarpa, and there's a bunch of seeds come up there, probably a dozen or more, and I've plotted up a lot of those and spread them around both this property and other people's property. That one below it, can I go backwards? I don't know if I can. Just that plant at the bottom there, the unusual things you find, that's a plant called Roripa gigantea, which is forest bitter cress. Never would have known that plant was on the property prior to the fire, and it's gone now, and it remained to be seen until there's another fire. So some of those plants are very particularly, you only see them after fire, similar to perhaps calamira and the kangaroo apple, which again, it's never grown on the property for the 40 years since we've been here. Here's a shot of some single species thickets, fire response species. On the left there, my brother, we're making a track in a gully that I'm going to turn into a rainforest, where the calamaria or the incense plant is so thick you need a machete to actually create the track. But I'll put most of the tracks in already, but I've still had to put a few more tracks in order to plant that out. So even as thick as it is, I'm planting rainforest species underneath that calamaria. The other two shots there being the kangaroo apple and black wattle, which are coming up as thick as you can see there. And at the moment, you just can't walk through them anymore. The shot on the left there is the gully that I'm planting as a rainforest, and I've got a land care grant for $10,000 to put up a fence. It's 800 metres long and encompasses about 6 hectares. It was really heavily or burnt very hot in the fire, so most of the eucalypt trees were actually killed, even though you can see a few on the top side of this gully that are alive. They've got the epicomic growth, which is in my benefit because I don't actually want eucalypts in the gully where I'm planting all those rainforest species. And to this point in time, I've put in quite a lot of rainforest species: lilipili, muttonwood, blanket leaf, musk daisy, yellowwood, austral mulberry, elderberry panax, and 20 more different species of vines. We're all going to go into that gully. It's only 6 kilometres from the Fairy Dell rainforest that Tom talked about in the last talk there. So it's in the near vicinity of other rainforests of importance, and this one has a fence around it, and I'm there to look after it. So I want to see that turn into a well-established and rainforest. It actually was, in my opinion. I'll just go next shot over. Oh no, perhaps I won't. I'll just I'll just talk about this. This is plant on. I'll talk more about the rainforest in a minute. That's that seedling there is a golden wattle, which was one of the first plants to come up in response to fire. You can see the ancestral bipinnate cotyledons there at the bottom, which is there's a fair bit you can talk about geomorphology of that. But anyhow, that's a very interesting plant as a seedling. Amelia from Trust for Nature here in Bannister asked me, do I have any passion fruits coming out on the property, which is the native Passiflora cinnabarina, which is one of my favourites, which I have found only 1 or 2 on the property in the 40 years I've been there. But since then, I've planted a few of them in my front yard, and this is growing along a trellis in front of my house, and this is the sort of response this plant will give you when the plant is in a happy state where it's growing with all the nutrients it needs. And I've been collecting the seed of this plant for years now and spread it around to local nurseries and thrown it on roadsides and in my own rainforest, actually, just thrown the seed. It's a very hardy seed and it responds to fire, similar to the bindweed. But yeah, it's coming up everywhere around my property as a result of being spread by wildlife, because the fruit's so succulent and juicy and smelly, it's been carried everywhere from this point where the house is. So that's been an interesting one. On the far left there's me standing in that gully that I am now revegetating as a rainforest. Immediately after the fire, and there's a single leaf in it. You can see, you know, the dead trees that are there, and it actually faces south or slightly east of south, so it's ideal for this purpose. And that's the centre picture of myself there, and that regrowth, that is Illyria agophyllum, or musk daisy. Musk daisy is a warm temperate rainforest plant, which was in that gully along with that other one you can see on the top right there, which is much bigger. Whoops, it's just gone. I'll go back to that one. And that larger stump is nearly a foot in diameter. It would have been hundreds of years old, and I therefore suspect that this gully was once a rainforest in eons gone by. How far back, we don't know, but there are those remnant species there. There are no musk daisies coming up as seedlings in this in this gully. I'll have to put them in myself, so there's no seed bank left for it. The bottom shot on the right there is Canuka tristomiopsis, and it's shooting along the river as lignotubers. Pretty much any larger plant is resprouting at the base, which is nice to know. It's Paul and Tess down the riverbank underneath the only remaining tree fern, which is a rough cyathea. It's very hard to walk to that point now, but I'll be planting a few more of those in my rainforest gully, so there'll be more of those to come. Just a quick one on the fence building, which didn't happen quickly, as you would imagine. I had a little bit of help with it. There's a young fellow there in the bottom left rather, who helped me unroll the wire down those steep slopes, but I had to hammer in 150 of these star pickets, which were 2.4 meters long, and that means you can't even get to the top of them. So I made up this steel post with a cap on the top and a cap on the bottom. So using a jackhammer down at the ground level, I could hit them in. Apart from having to cart the generator around with me, that did the job quite well. So we were happy with that. Some helpers along the way in the rainforest gully again. We've got my brother and sister here helping pull out eucalypts and wattles in the area that I want to revegetate. So I'm acting as God here, getting rid of wattles and eucalypts at seedling stage, so that I can preference the rainforest to have all the species that I want, and not those ones that are going to suck up the moisture, which is the case at the moment, given that those eucalypts that are there that have been so impacted by fire, they're not sucking up moisture. It's just the undergrowth utilising it, and that's why the undergrowth is actually going so hard. Centre picture there, the centre picture there with Brendan Condon and his partner behind him, and Robyn in the background. Brendan, people would know, he started Australian Ecosystems along with Damien Cook on the far right. He's helped me with 3,000 plants yet to come. He's donated for this project, and Damien on the far right there is giving a lot of advice on what to do in relation to revegetating this project. So just that photo there again on the left is from about 6 months ago, the gully with all the Calamarian kangaroo apple just taking off. But now you can't even get a picture of that. It's just so thick. You can't walk through it, except for the tracks that I've already put through it, which are substantial. There's a woofer there in the middle photo who's helped with that project, and for a couple of days put the tracks in when we could. And there's the regen and the down at the river, but you can't quite see the Canuka coming back in that shot, but it certainly has. Just a quick one here. This bucket of sawdust has got the passion fruit seed in it and the forest bindweed, the Millenbeckia. So I've thrown that throughout my gully. So in preparation for the next fire, those species assist in a process of recolonisation, revegetation. So I've thrown the seed in place, so it's there for the future. So I may never see those plants grow, but they will last 50 years sitting in the soil. That's the last shot there. It's just showing the Callum area. In that gully, it's now 4 metres tall and thick, as you can see there. But I'm marching through it to put the plants underneath it. It's a project which will go on for the rest of my life with diversity improving and increasing onward from this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. A very interesting landholder's perspective. The work you've been doing is legendary. That's great. I'd like now to introduce Andrew Murray from the Department of Environment, Land and Water and Planning. Now, Andrew is the Operations Manager, Southern Arc Project. He has worked on wildlife management for the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning and its predecessors in Far East Gippsland for over 30 years. And he's managed the Southern Arc Project for the last 15. Now, his presentation is pre-recorded, but we hope he'll be able to attend the Q&A session. His topic is the post-fire survival of Victoria's long-footed Potoroo in Far East Gippsland. So thanks, Suzanne, if you can place that into...
G'day, my name's Andy Murray. I'm the Operations Manager for the Southern Arc Project, and I'm here today to give you a bit of an overview of the post-fire survival of long-footed Potoroos in Far East Gippsland. So before we really get going, it's probably good to know exactly what a long-footed Potoroo is. It's a 2 kilogram marsupial in the Potoroo family. It's the largest Potoroo still in existence. They're confined to those forests in Far East Gippsland and a smaller population in the northeast of Victoria. They're listed nationally and internationally as endangered. Their food is almost entirely truffles, so the sporing bodies of underground fungi that live in association with a wide range of different types of plants. And by doing that, they have an important role in dispersing this fungi throughout the forest. They are mainly threatened by introduced predators, specifically the red fox. In Far East Gippsland, the distribution of the long-footed Potoroos is entirely encompassed within the Southern Arc Project, which is a major ongoing fox control program which covers over 1 million hectares. We have over 3,500 permanent bait stations established that are baited throughout the year, and this has been in operation for over 15 years now, and foxes have been driven to very low levels within this area. Part of our project involves the use of camera traps to survey for wildlife populations throughout our landscape. In 2016-2017, we surveyed over 720 sites and detected long-footed Potoroos at 205 of these sites. This is indicated in the map on the right-hand side. The green sites are where we detected long-footed Potoroos, and the red sites are those which didn't detect long-footed Potoroos. Following on from our fantastic results in 2016-2017, we got the cameras back out into the field in 2019 to start surveying again. We surveyed the first 240 sites in late 2019, and we detected long-footed Potoroos at 83 of these sites. The cameras were then moved to the second set of 240 sites in early December, and unfortunately that's when the fires then swept through Far East Gippsland from late December through to late February, and we lost over 120 cameras during those fires. From December through to late February, the fires swept through Far East Gippsland and burnt approximately 70% of the Southern Arc footprint. This is a map of Far East Gippsland, indicating within the red polygon the area that is baited for foxes as part of the Southern Arc Project. The large yellow circle is the general distribution of long-footed Potoroos in Far East Gippsland, and the hashed area is the area that was subjected to fires in the 2019-2020 fire season. So you can see that quite a large area of the distribution of long-footed Potoroos was burnt during the fires. During the fires, the media did tend to focus a lot on the impact on our wildlife, and there was quite a bit of speculation about the possibility of a range of species, including long-footed Potoroos, being driven to extinction as a result of the fires. While we were also concerned about the survivorship of a wide range of different species as a result of the fires, we did start to get some evidence that things had actually pulled through. While we did lose a lot of cameras, we did find some cameras that sort of survived the fire. They came through looking like this. And when we checked the SD cards for some of them, found that, yes, we found photos of fires going through the landscape, but then in the post-fire landscape, and this site wasn't burnt particularly hard, we did see evidence of animals surviving after the fires. So here's a lace monitor, mountain brush-tail possums, and long-footed Potoroos. So these animals were in the landscape post-fire. We did find other evidence that gave us hope that long-footed Potoroos had survived the fire. I went looking for cameras at this site just north of Orbost, and as you can see, it is pretty heavily burnt. While I didn't find the cameras at that site, what I did find were a lot of digs of long-footed Potoroos where they'd found truffles, broken them open and eaten the contents. So what we can see here are the shells of those truffles, those sporocarps, lying on the ground where the Potoroos have just left them. Here's just another photo of some of the sporocarps that I'd picked up and the landscape that they were found in. So we did have hope that the Potoroos had survived. When we went back and put cameras at that site, sure enough, we found long-footed Potoroos there. That's a mother and a very large young at heel. So we decided it was going to be pretty important to get out to the 83 sites where we had detected long-footed Potoroos in late 2019 and resurvey those sites. Of those sites, 75 had been burnt and then 8 remained unburnt. And we camera trapped those sites again in April, May 2020. We were really happy to find that of those sites, 47 still had long-footed Potoroos at them. So 57% of the sites that had detected the species before the fire still had them after the fire. Of course, they were detected at all of the 8 unburnt sites where they had been detected prior to the fires. This map indicates the distribution of where we found those Potoroos from those 83 sites that we surveyed. The green sites are where we detected long-footed Potoroos, and the red sites is where we didn't detect them after the fires. So you can see there's quite a good distribution of their numbers across the landscape. We went on to survey another 666 sites across the landscape, and we were able to find long-footed Potoroos at 94 of those sites. So in total, of the 249 sites that we surveyed for long-footed Potoroos, we detected them at 141 sites, which again works out to be around about 57% of the sites that we surveyed. Long-footed Potoroos, as I said, were detected right across the entire known distribution of the species in far East Gippsland, which is probably what we would like to see. We wouldn't want to find them confined to a very small area. And this is the map of those 249 sites surveyed. Again, with the sites where we detected long-footed Potoroos indicated in green. So again, you can see there's quite a good distribution of the animals right across their known distribution in far East Gippsland. Here's just a few photos of some of the long-footed Potoroos we detected. Here's a female with a a joey's tail hanging out of the pouch. This graph illustrates the percentage of sites that were present in each of the fire severity classes. So we can see that over 42% of the sites that we surveyed for long-footed Potoroos occurred in the high canopy scorch. Interestingly enough, about half of those still retained long-footed Potoroos. So regardless of the severity of the fires, we were still able to find Potoroos in some of those areas. So to wrap up, we found long-footed Potoroos survived in areas that had been impacted by fires, some quite severe. They continued to be distributed across an area of approximately 400,000 hectares. The ongoing fox control at that landscape scale was likely to have been beneficial both before and after the fires for the long-footed Potoroos, and follow-up camera trapping surveys in 2021 will provide more data on the current distribution of long-footed Potoroos in far East Gippsland. And I'll leave it there.
Well, that's fantastic. That's really good to hear from Andy. So now we're going to move over to the panel discussion, and we have a little extra time for that. This is going to involve a Q&A involving the participants and the panelists. Now, let me introduce Shay Brennan, who with Amelia Horton will manage the Q&A session. They'll read the selected questions and note the name of the questioner and highlight the panel member to which the question will be directed. So over to you, Shay and Amelia.
Thanks, Teen. And can I just say it's been so fantastic to listen to all of the presenters on so many different topics. I've certainly learned a lot, so thank you very much to all. We've had a few questions come through, so I'm going to work through a list which we have compiled, and I'll throw to each of the speakers to answer. So there have been a few, but we'll get through as many as we can. So Deirdre, a few questions for you. Can you please elaborate on why it is so important to treat feral herbivores? And was there also a problem with feral predators?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Amelia. The need to treat feral herbivores and predators is about protecting our high biodiversity EVCs, the grazing that goes on by deer in particular across some of the areas, the effect that they have with their wallows that occur in the alpine bogs and the peatland areas. Peatlands are essentially the first form of filtration for our waterways as well, so it's important that we maintain the vegetation communities in there. With predators too, the primary reason that we treat our predators, which are foxes predominantly, and you just heard from Andy about the predation on the long-footed Potoroos, but also we know feral cats are a huge issue. They're not a primary target in the work that Parks Victoria does, but they are a secondary target, so that if our ground shooters see them, they will certainly deal with them appropriately. They predate on our critical weight range mammals. Without this help, they may not reoccur in the numbers that we'd like to see them. Thanks, Amelia.
Thanks, Deirdre. And a question around what is being done on the effect of the spread of Phytophthora.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm sorry if you can't hear me. It's absolutely pouring down on my roof at the moment. Phytophthora is a biosecurity risk, along with a lot of other weeds and seeds, in particular funguses and spores that we have that travel through our parks. Phytophthora in particular, we make sure that we look at washing down our vehicles as they move from different areas, and DELWP has the same procedures, and also minimise foot traffic off tracks, which helps for the spread of Phytophthora. Biosecurity has become an issue for us post-fire. We know that in fires, we don't always have the luxury of taking our time and moving around. They can be quite reactive, and the crews do their best that they can. But we're also seeing some weeds emerge on roadsides from fodder that was brought into the areas as well. So it is a front of mind for not just DELWP and Parks Victoria, but also for local councils who manage a lot of the roadsides through the areas.
Thanks, Deirdre. And one final question around the aerial deer control and what happens with the carcasses.
Yeah, so the carcasses from the target animals are left in place. There is a operational procedure that animals are not targeted in waterways, and there is a buffer around waterways that they won't be targeted in that area. If a carcass does land in a waterway, it will be removed by people going in on foot and doing that, but we leave the carcasses in place as to where they're treated.
Thanks very much. And now I'll throw over to you, Brett, for a few questions around the deer control. What would you expect the recovering landscape to look like if the deer control wasn't being undertaken?
Look, yeah, some of those species that everything recruits after a fire, and look, the deer were impacted just as all other fauna after the fires, and numbers did reduce, but they were pushed into little remnants and little sections and often covenanted property. So that initial impact from all browsers, including introduced deer, can make a huge difference to the final outcome as to how plants survive. Once those nursery plants start to fall away from juvenile to adolescence, and the eruption of more mature plants through to adult and older stages, you will lose plants if they're browsed out very early, or later on if they're rubbed or destroyed from excessive browsing through that adolescent stage. So it's a critical thing to deal with the deer in that early stage.
And oh, sorry.
Sorry,
I was just going to say, given that the deer can be quite elusive, Brett, how do you actually undertake the deer population assessments?
Look, I've been involved with deer for over 40 years, and look, I do a visual walk through the properties, and I take notes of all the different footprints, the different movement lines, bedding, and social interaction places throughout each property, and that will give me a fair measure of individuals. I also mix that in with camera trapping as well, so that basically supports what I've seen on the ground. That goes together for a report for each of the properties, and touch wood, so far it's been pretty accurate. So the numbers and spread of animals in each of the properties have been removed, just as I predicted. So it's been a great tool for the contractors. They can seriously target where they need to go, and efficiencies improved. They're not there for that long, and we're ending up with a great outcome. The deer have been pretty much removed from all of our covenanted properties, which has been great.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And Paul, over to you. Can you talk a little bit about how you got rid of the arum lily?
And shares. Where's me? Yes, hello. How did I get rid of the arum lily? We sprayed it using a mixture of we went in when it wasn't wet, and because there was the drought, and basically sprayed it carefully using backpacks, backpack spray packs that were guarded, and we realized that the amount of wildlife in there, so we basically would work an area, go because it was sporadic, and we'd sort of kick the leaves to make sure everything buggered off, frogs and hopefully the snakes. And then it was sprayed with a brush off based mixture, which seems to knock it pretty well.
Thanks, Paul. And just thinking back to one of the sites that you visited, do you think that it could shift towards more of a rainforest as a result of the fire and the inkweed?
As a result of the fire and the inkweed, would it shift towards rainforest? Highly unlikely, I would have thought, given that the negative effects of fire on rainforest. Yeah, rainforest you can simply describe as a plant community that is not tolerant of fire. So I wouldn't have thought it would do anything to enhance it. The presence of inkweed, look, I've come across people who have said, oh, it just pops up after fire and it'll disappear again. It'll get crowded out. But when I look at that sort of river of it, and it's got to suppress other things that you would prefer to grow. You know, it's a competition based thing for me. And the fact that it will then be laying down an enormous amount of seed for the next event, which may be fire related, or it may be a disturbance event or a flood or whatever, and it'll pop up again. And so on that scale, I can't see that the presence of inkweed would be of assistance to the any rainforest that would try to recruit there. I think there would just be too much competition, and you know what you're trying to do is advantage the species that you want against the species that you don't want. So yeah, that's the way I'd look at it.
Thank you, Paul.
Pleasure.
And now over to you, Andrew. It was so great to see the platypus. Are you able to talk a little bit about how prolific the population was in Narrial Creek before the fires? And do you think it'll return?
The population of platypus?
Yeah.
I can't speak to how abundant they were before the fire. I don't have that information, but platypus, I've seen this with other fire events as well. I suspect that platypus are often a lot hardier than we give them credit for. You know, they either have their burrows, or as someone said, the old wombat burrow may provide all sorts of refuge for animals because they have their own burrows. But yeah, when you see how bad the rivers looked, and since then, and I've heard reports from other waterways as well, platypus have certainly been seen. I've seen 3, I would say definitely different animals, like several kilometres apart in the Narrial since then over the last 12 months. And, you know, we're sort of, yeah, it's quite common to see platypus around our work sites from previous jobs and before. We know that whilst we're working for fish habitat, at the end of the day, it's for the aquatic ecosystem and all the layers that build up through that, which of course the platypus is well truly part of that ecosystem. So yeah, I don't have the stats, the numbers, but it is very heartening to see them around, that's for sure.
Absolutely. And in terms of protecting riparian areas, do you have any recommendations for landholders around how they might be able to protect or enhance aquatic ecosystems on their land?
Pardon me. Absolutely. Look, if you could do one thing for a waterway, and only one thing, right across the board, it's exclude livestock. I mean, cows, particularly cows. You know, they're big, heavy animals that you know, actively manipulate and damage those environments and whatever. So if you do one thing, that's get the cows out. That's often easier said than done, and that's one of our biggest challenges working with landholders, because they're running businesses, and if you fence the cows out, you're also fencing them away from their water source. So then you need to provide alternative watering for them, and fencing that can withstand flooding and so on, and so the cascade of challenges what sounds like a really simple thing, you know, flows on from there. But, you know, failing that, I think as much as anything is hastened slowly. Like our revegetation efforts, we work on a fairly small suite of plants initially because, and focusing heavily on the disturbance response type plants in those areas. When you look at riparian areas and how they recover naturally, you know, some plants, even eucalypts in some areas, are your disturbance response plant, and they come up in incredibly thick numbers. And so I think sometimes just sitting back and seeing what comes back first, and taking your time a little bit, taking the deep breath, is very important. But yeah, the one thing is to try and minimise that predation on the plants from livestock. You know, we've heard about, you know, deer, pretty tricky, kangaroos, you know, just as hard. Not much you can do to influence that, you know, other than a small site scale. But yeah, one thing you can do is restrict livestock access, and that's really important.
Thank you, Andrew. And now over to you, Tom. What can landholders do to provide good quality habitat for owls on their properties?
Well, it's really about retaining the big old trees as best as you possibly can. So avoiding clearing them and avoiding them having being subject to fire in the first place. Supplementary habitat is an option as well. We're not really clear on how well supplementary habitat is used by the different owl species, but there are instances where it has been used. So certainly protecting that primary habitat resource in the form of big trees in the first place is the highest priority. But supplementary habitat is also an option where those key habitat resources have been impacted.
Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about the specifics of the nest boxes for the owls?
So again, it depends a little bit on which species of owls you're talking about. The ones that our organisation has put up in the past have been specifically designed around the habitat requirements of the mast owl. So mast owls tend to build nests in the big old hollow pipes of the main trunk or the main stem of trees, as opposed to accessing hollows in branches, which are more often used by the other owl species. So the ones that we've constructed seek to replicate that same sort of habitat structure, the big hollow pipe form, and we actually used culvert pipe suspended high up in the canopy of trees. I will say that we haven't been able to demonstrate that that's particularly effective in terms of its use to date. But there are look, the owls are so widespread, but so low in abundance in the first place, and in lots of instances there is some habitat around. It's really unclear whether they're not using it because they're not there, or they're using natural habitat in preference to the artificial stuff that we've installed. So it really depends on the species that you're looking to provide the habitat for, as to what type and the style and the height and all that kind of stuff that that you use.
Thank you, Tom. And now, John, a few questions for you. Given that your property has many different weed species, can you talk a little bit about how you have prioritised the weed control?
Prioritise weed control. Yeah, well, my wife Robyn was pretty keen on getting rid of a lot of weeds initially after the fire because they were coming up so clearly and easy to be seen. But it turns out that certain plant species that are weeds after fire, you simply cannot do anything about. And that's particularly the cat, what do you call it? Catweed? No. It's trying to think of the genera now. Basically, plants that produce huge numbers of, well, for example, fleabane is typical. Produce huge numbers of very small seeds that fly in the wind. You simply can't stop them. So on our property, there was a fair bit of that. And it's not worth trying to take them out. But apart from that, there weren't many other weeds. I sprayed for blackberries along the river in one spot. And I'm happy to say that our property has very few weeds on it. So I did find some inkweed pulled out, just only a few of them. So where you've got small numbers, you can weed them out. But really, you've got to look at the potential to achieve your end goal. If you're pulling out a plant which is just going to reseed itself so liberally after a fire, you're wasting your time. And those smaller weeds can be what you call non-disruptive anyhow in their nature. So you're best just to leave them and tackle those which ones you can handle or make an effect on.
Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about the time frame in between finishing the weed control and commencing the revegetation?
Now you mentioned weed control again there. No, so I guess I was weeding out wattles and eucalypts, and that's not weed control as such. It's just preferencing the species in that rainforest so that the plants I put in become the dominant ones, and they don't have to compete against the eucalypts. So no time frame at all. I just went straight into it as soon as I could. Matter of fact, before I even put a fence up, I started planting lily-pillies and muttonwoods and things that I knew weren't going to be impacted by deer or whoever it was anyhow. Deer was the reason for putting the fence up. It's a deer exclusion fence. But I didn't actually need to put that fence up so early in the piece because the first vegetation that occurs after fire is so lush and so thick that deer actually have too much food available to them. And I wasn't particularly worried that they would they eat anything that I was putting in as a seedling. So even though I had to get on with the project, so I had to put the fence up regardless, but the fence is there for future, not for the immediate. When things get tough and dry, a rainforest gully is just going to attract deer, and that's when they're going to do the damage. So the fence is already up and I'm planting in it, and I actually did install water irrigation throughout that 6 hectares so I can use it to plant, not so much to irrigate, but as a water for my planting. I put 4 litres on every plant I put in, and I dig a deep hole and put vegetation around it after I put it in. I'm getting more than 90% survival on whatever I put in that zone. So yeah, that's working well.
That's fantastic. And in terms of the fence that you have installed, John, can you talk a little bit about the design and the construction of that fence?
Yeah, it's a standard deer fence. It's 17 wire horizontal stranded and star picket every 5 metres. So it's fairly simple. There's only one lot of wire that needs rolling out, except for the overhead single wire that I used to actually delineate the line that the poles took and the fence took. But it's just a hands and feet job. I mean, as a matter of fact, if I had got a contractor to put that fence in, there's no way I could have afforded it. It would have been probably $40,000 or $50,000. In the end, it actually cost maybe 6,000 because I did the work. And I think if I had a contractor do it, they want to get in there with machinery and a bulldozer and put tracks in. It was hands and feet, roll the wire down the hillside and put it up. And it happened pretty damn quick. And using that tool, I had to hit the posts in, a couple of days. Those star pickets were in. I couldn't believe how quick that fence actually happened with the help of so few people. So I think really, you've got an idea to do something like that. Just think about it yourself, how you can go about it, and just get stuck into it. And you'll find within a short period of time, you'll have yourself a deer fence on a very special bit of property that'll always be protected.
Thank you, John. And just another question in terms of the reseeding. Can you just mention again why you were scattering the passion fruit seed and the calamera around the area?
Well, it wasn't. I didn't have to put in the seed of the calamera. That's there in tens of thousands. That plant is about to reseed. It's actually a biennial plant. It'll have the seed heads on it next spring, next summer. But the seeds I was putting in was forest bindweed, which is not often seen, but it's a fire response plant around the edges of rainforest and actually right in the middle of them. If rainforest gets burned, it comes up real thick and you cannot actually walk through it or even see the ground. And that allows, as I did try and explain, the rainforest seedlings underneath to actually get started without being hampered by wattles and eucalypts. So it's actually beneficial to a rehabilitation of a rainforest site. So, but those species, both that bindweed and the passion fruit, weren't in that gully. I've planted some passion fruits, but they won't necessarily do all that well. You really, the seed needs to be activated by heat or ash from fire, and then rain, of course, as well. But if you put the seed there, those particular species the seed will sit in the ground for unknown lengths of time. Like there's 40 years since the last fire came through this property, and the kangaroo apple just shot up everywhere. It's never been seen in that time period. Those seeds could last double that time period, 80 years, 100, who knows? We have no idea.
Thanks so much, John. I think we are about run out of time for questions. So thank you everyone who has sent in some questions for the panelists, and thanks very much to all the panelists for presenting today and also for taking a few questions. I'll hand over back to Tien, and I'll say thank you very much to Tien and Suzanne and the Australian Association of Bush Regenerators for working with us to present this webinar today. Thanks, Tien.
Thanks so much, Amelia. That's really good. And I'd like to reiterate that. A big thank you to everyone, particularly the speakers. We've had 7 very informative talks about impact and recovery on native vegetation in northeast Victoria, and I should say ecosystems in general, because we're talking about vegetation and fauna, and it's lovely to see the balance of flora and fauna in this particular seminar. So yes, the speakers covered topics including pest and native fauna, so the impact and recovery on native fauna, including platypus, owls and wallabies, and various other fauna, vegetation impacts and recovery. And it was alarming to see the massive erosion and impacts on streams, but the recovery of aquatic fauna, slow but sure. This has occurred similarly in New South Wales. In fact, the messages are very similar to those we're seeing in New South Wales, and it's great to see the landholder perspectives. Again, this is very similar across the east coast of New South Wales. So the positive message from the webinar seems to be that early intervention with that is ecologically informed does lead to positive outcomes, but the impacts are going to be felt for many decades, if not much, much longer, particularly for rainforest. So I particularly thank the speakers, but also the Trust for Nature staff, Amelia, Min, Shay and Robyn, and Arbor's technical support from Suzanne, Pritchard and Sean. And I'd like to thank all the audience and attendees. Without you, we wouldn't have this workshop, and we wouldn't have had such an interesting discussion session. Now, we're going to, we have on the screen now a series of links to some resources that you might find useful on this topic. And a recording of the webinar will be publicly available on the Arbor Regen TV website. We'll let registrants know when that happens, but you or anyone else can subscribe to the Arbor YouTube channel, or better, it's the Regen TV YouTube channel, and you'll then be alerted about any new uploads. So that's the recording of the webinar. And we'd also like you to keep in touch. So we're going to put up on the screen now some links to both our organisations. So we note that there's a branch of Arbor in Victoria, and inquiries for Victoria is to email vicbranch@arbor.org.au, and Trust for Nature links are on the screen as well, including Facebook links and website links. So again, thanks to all the panelists for participating, and thanks for all those who attended. We hope that you've benefited from the information shared in this session, and that you continue to do great work on the ground. It's very inspiring. So we'll now end the session for everyone. Goodbye and keep in touch. Thank you.